By 1917, the First World War had entered its third year, and the strain on the warring nations was becoming unbearable. The conflict had devolved into a grueling war of attrition, with no end in sight. However, this year would prove to be a turning point in the war, marked by dramatic events that would reshape the course of the conflict. From the Russian Revolution to the entry of the United States into the war, 1917 was a year of upheaval and transformation. This part of the story explores the key events of 1917 and their impact on the war. In Russia, the strain of the war had pushed the Tsarist regime to the brink of collapse. The Russian economy was in shambles, food shortages were widespread, and the morale of the army was at an all-time low. The Russian people, weary of the war and the incompetence of the government, began to demand change. In February 1917, march by the Gregorian calendar, protests and strikes broke out in Petrograd, modern-day St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire. The protests quickly escalated into a full-scale revolution as soldiers and workers joined the demonstrations. Tsar Nicholas II, unable to control the situation, abdicated the throne on March 15, 1917, bringing an end to over 300 years of Romanov rule. A provisional government was established, led by liberal politicians who sought to continue the war effort while implementing political reforms. However, the provisional government faced opposition from the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers that represented the more radical elements of the revolution. The Soviet called for an end to the war and the redistribution of land to the peasants, creating a power struggle between the two factions. The provisional government's decision to continue the war proved deeply unpopular, and its authority continued to erode. In October 1917, November by the Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks, a radical socialist party led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a coup d'état. The Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread, and they quickly moved to negotiate an end to the war. In December 1917, the Bolsheviks signed an armistice with Germany, and in March 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, formally ending Russia's participation in the war. The treaty was a harsh one, requiring Russia to cede vast territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, to Germany and its allies. The Russian Revolution and the subsequent withdrawal of Russia from the war had profound implications for the conflict, as it allowed Germany to focus its efforts on the Western Front. While Russia was exiting the war, the United States was preparing to enter it. The U.S. had remained neutral for the first 3 years of the conflict, but a series of events in 1917 would push the nation into the fray. In January 1917, Germany resumed its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, declaring that all ships, including those of neutral nations, would be targeted in the war zone around the British Isles. This policy led to the sinking of several American merchant ships, including the Lusitania in 1915, which had already strained relations between the US and Germany. In February 1917, the British intercepted and decrypted a secret telegram from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. The telegram proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico, with the promise of helping Mexico regain territories lost to the U.S. such as Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, if the U.S. entered the war. The British shared the telegram with the U.S. and its publication in American newspapers caused outrage. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, stating that the world must be made safe for democracy. On April 6, 1917, the U.S. formally entered the war, marking a turning point in the conflict. The entry of the U.S. brought fresh troops, resources, and morale to the Allied cause, and it would prove decisive in the final year of the war. On the Western Front, the war continued to grind on with no end in sight. The Allies launched a series of offensives in 1917, hoping to break the stalemate, but these efforts resulted in heavy casualties and minimal gains. In April 1917, the French launched the Nivelle offensive, named after General Robert Nivelle, who promised a decisive breakthrough. However, the offensive was a disaster, with the French army suffering over 100,000 casualties in the first week alone. The failure of the offensive led to widespread mutinies in the French army, as soldiers refused to continue the senseless slaughter. In July 1917, the British launched the Third Battle of Ypres, also known as the Battle of Passchendaele, in Flanders, Belgium. The battle was fought in appalling conditions, with heavy rain turning the battlefield into a sea of mud. The British and their allies suffered over 300,000 casualties, and the battle became a symbol of the futility and horror of trench warfare. On the Italian front, the war took a dramatic turn in October 1917, when the Austro-Hungarian and German armies launched a surprise offensive at Caporetto, modern-day Kobarid, Slovenia. The Italian army, poorly prepared and demoralized, was overwhelmed, and the front collapsed. The Italians were forced to retreat over 60 miles, losing over 300,000 men in the process. The disaster at Caporetto led to a change in Italian leadership and a renewed determination to hold the line. In the Middle East, the war took a different turn, as the British launched a campaign against the Ottoman Empire. In December 1917, British forces under General Edmund Allenby captured Jerusalem, a significant symbolic victory for the Allies. The fall of Jerusalem marked the beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. The events of 1917 marked a turning point in the war. The Russian Revolution and the withdrawal of Russia from the war shifted the balance of power, while the entry of the United States brought new hope to the Allies. On the battlefields, the war continued to exact a heavy toll, but the seeds of change had been sown. The final year of the war would see the culmination of these events, as the Allies launched a final push for victory. To be continued. By 1918, the First World War had entered its fourth year, and the strain on all sides was reaching a breaking point. The war had become a global conflict, consuming millions of lives and reshaping entire societies. However, the events of 1917 had set the stage for a dramatic shift in the balance of power. The entry of the United States into the war, combined with the collapse of Russia and the exhaustion of the Central Powers, created an opportunity for the Allies to launch a final, decisive push for victory. This part of the story explores the key events of 1918, from the German Spring Offensive to the Allied counter-offensive and the eventual armistice that ended the war. In early 1918, Germany faced a critical juncture. The withdrawal of Russia from the war had allowed Germany to transfer hundreds of thousands of troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, giving them a temporary numerical advantage. However, the entry of the United States into the war meant that fresh American troops were arriving in Europe in increasing numbers. German General Erich Ludendorff knew that time was running out, and he decided to launch a massive offensive in the spring of 1918, hoping to break the Allied lines before the Americans could fully deploy. The German Spring Offensive, codenamed Operation Michael, began on March 21, 1918. The Germans employed new tactics, including infiltration units, stormtroopers that bypassed strongpoints and attacked weak points in the Allied lines. The offensive initially achieved significant gains, with the Germans advancing up to 40 miles in some areas, the largest territorial gains on the Western Front since 1914. However, the German advance began to stall as supply lines stretched thin and Allied resistance stiffened. The British and French, under the unified command of French General Ferdinand Foch, coordinated their defenses and launched counterattacks. By early April, the German offensive had lost momentum, and the Allies had managed to stabilize the front. The German spring offensive came at a tremendous cost. The Germans suffered over 500,000 casualties, including many of their best troops. The offensive had failed to achieve its strategic objectives, and the German army was left exhausted and demoralized. The Allies, though battered, had held the line and were now preparing to launch their own counter-offensive. In the summer of 1918, the Allies launched a series of offensives that would become known as the 100 Days Offensive. This campaign marked the beginning of the end for the Central Powers, as the Allies pushed the Germans back on multiple fronts. The Allied counter-offensive began on August 8, 1918, with the Battle of Amiens. The British, French, and Australian forces, supported by tanks and aircraft, launched a surprise attack on the German lines. The battle was a resounding success, with the Allies advancing over 7 miles on the first day, a remarkable achievement after years of stalemate. German General Ludendorff later referred to August 8 as the Black Day of the German Army, as it marked the beginning of the collapse of German morale. Following the success at Amiens, the Allies launched a series of coordinated offensives along the Western Front. The French and American forces attacked in the Meuse-Argonne region, while the British and Commonwealth forces pushed forward in Flanders and along the Somme. The Allies employed new tactics, including combined arms operations and the effective use of tanks and aircraft, to break through the German defenses. The German army, exhausted and outnumbered, began to retreat. By September 1918, the Allies had breached the Hindenburg Line, Germany's last line of defense. The German High Command realized that the war could not be won and began to seek an armistice. As the Allies advanced on the Western Front, the Central Powers began to collapse on other fronts as well. In September 1918, the Allies launched an offensive in the Balkans, targeting Bulgaria. The Bulgarian army, weakened by years of war, was quickly overwhelmed, and Bulgaria signed an armistice on September 29, 1918. The collapse of Bulgaria opened the way for the Allies to advance into the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On the Italian front, the Allies launched a final offensive in October 1918, known as the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The Austro-Hungarian army, already demoralized and suffering from internal unrest, was unable to hold the line. The Italian forces broke through the Austrian defenses, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire began to disintegrate. On November 3, 1918, Austria-Hungary signed an armistice, effectively ending the war on the Italian front. In the Middle East, the British continued their advance against the Ottoman Empire. In September 1918, British forces under General Edmund Allenby launched the Battle of Megiddo, a decisive victory that led to the capture of Damascus and Aleppo. The Ottoman Empire, already weakened by years of war, signed an armistice on October 30, 1918. By November 1918, Germany was isolated and facing imminent defeat. The German army was in retreat, the home front was in chaos, and revolution was brewing. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, and a provisional government was established. The new government, led by Friedrich Ebert, sought an immediate end to the war. On November 11, 1918, at 5 a.m. German representatives signed an armistice agreement with the Allies in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, France. The armistice went into effect at 11 a.m. marking the end of hostilities on the Western Front. The war that had claimed over 16 million lives and reshaped the world was finally over. The end of the First World War brought relief to a war-weary world, but it also left a legacy of devastation and uncertainty. The war had redrawn the map of Europe, toppled empires, and set the stage for future conflicts. The human cost of the war was staggering, with millions of soldiers and civilians dead, wounded, or displaced. The war had also transformed societies, accelerating social and political change and leaving a deep psychological scar on those who had lived through it. As the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world began to grapple with the consequences of the war and the challenges of building a lasting peace. The road to recovery would be long and difficult, but the end of the war marked the beginning of a new era, one shaped by the lessons and legacies of the Great War. To be continued.